Since I haven't been back to the lower states in the past 35 years, with the exception of being there 6 weeks in 2023, after visiting my family this summer for 3 months in Virginia and driving from the West Coast to the East Coast, I thought now would be a good time to compare 6 things in Alaska to the lower states. Number one is we all know there's more traffic on the streets in the lower states. But I find it curious how everybody is trying to beat everybody else to the next red light, weaving in and out of traffic just to stop ahead and sit at the next corner. And if you've been gone from the lower states for a long period of time, you do notice how easy it is to get sucked back into that type of rushing around. It's very different than driving on an empty highway in Alaska where you can relax and take things a little slower. The second thing would be buy one and get one free in grocery stores, which is missing in Alaska. Buy a watermelon and get a second one for free, or you can buy a chicken sandwich and get a second one for free. But in Alaska, you seldom, if ever, see buy one, get one free anywhere. You also have less sales or discounts on groceries in Alaska than you do in the lower states. The third thing has been brought up often in my previous videos, which is grocery prices. While I drove through the US, what I noticed was in the small, more remote towns in the lower states, they were nearly as expensive as in the small towns in Alaska. As an example, Oreos in my town in Alaska cost $8.99. While Oreos in Ritzville, Washington State, which is in the middle of nowhere and a small remote town, cost $7.99. But as we all know, in the bigger cities in the lower states, food is much lower than in the bigger cities in Alaska. It may not be very accurate when I say this, but something that I noticed and experienced driving from the West Coast to the East Coast is that the closer you get to the East Coast, the cheaper almost everything becomes, foods and gasoline and anything else. Of course, I'm sure there's some exceptions like New York City or Washington, D.C. is maybe more expensive than Virginia or South Carolina, but in general, I spent less money in Idaho than I did in Washington State, and I spent less money on things in South Dakota than I did in Idaho. And I spent less money on things in Indiana than I spent in South Dakota, and so on. It just seemed like the further I got east, the cheaper things became. The fifth thing I want to talk about, to me, is very important, and that's the attitude or maybe even the way people look driving through the states compared to Alaska. What I noticed, regardless of what state I was in, with the exception of very small remote towns where everyone seems to be smiling and happy, is about 50% of the people you see in grocery stores or in general stores have expressions of misery or future serial killers on their faces. 50% of the people look so angry shopping for their bananas and their socks. Now, of course, that's not really fair to compare to people in Alaska, because most towns in Alaska are small with fewer people. And when you see less people, you see less of the bad things. I'm sure there's plenty of people who live in Alaska who are miserable, walking around kicking everything in their home and punching every second tree they pass while they walk through the woods, but you just don't see it because there are so few people living there. The last thing I want to talk about is something I think that I learned while I was here that I thought I knew and I didn't. And that's people rushing around all the time. Why do they put themselves through that in the lower states? I used to believe that people in the lower states have an addiction to rushing around and trying to do everything in one day and causing themselves a lot of stress and putting pressure on themselves to get things done just so they can do the same rushing around the next day and the next day and the next day. But after driving through the lower states this past summer, I started realizing there seems to be a reason why people are always rushing to get someplace just to get to someplace else in the lower states. For example, one day I had to go to the grocery store to get an oil change, to stop at the bank, and to mail off one package at the post office in Virginia. Each location was within 8 miles from where I was staying. When I got to Firestone for the oil change, I had to wait for about an hour and 20 minutes, despite having an appointment. Then when I got to the post office, there were 7 people in front of me and I was standing in line for 20 minutes. When I got to the bank, there were 3 people in front of me and it took me 10 more minutes just to put $100 into my account. And when I got to the grocery store, there were 18 aisles and all of the 4 items I needed were as far as possible away from each other. Bread was in aisle 1, iced tea was in aisle 11, and ham and cheese was in aisle 17. By the time I got 4 items, it felt like I had run a marathon. And then I had to wait in line behind 3 people buying food for an entire village, and I was in the grocery store for over 20 minutes. Add to that all of the red lights and waiting in line in traffic and slow-moving traffic, and it took me over 3.5 hours and my entire afternoon to do these 4 simple tasks. Now, the town where I live in Alaska, to do the 4 exact same things would take me about 45 to 50 minutes, because everything is next door to everything else, with no lines and no traffic and no waiting. So what I feel like I learned this summer is maybe that's why people rush around all the time to do errands every day in the lower states. It's because simple errands take so long to do. And that's why I feel that people who live in Alaska do seem to have a lot more free time to sit on the side of the road overlooking valleys or next to the lakes and just to relax a little bit more. Even in the late summer and early fall, when they're spending most of their free time preparing for the winter, because errands just don't take as long when there are less people, less cars, and less of everything else. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's just a quick one I put together as I prepare to head back to Alaska. I'll be leaving in a few days and look forward to uploading videos of my drive back home.